2 words. No deal. That short phrase seems to sum up the long-awaited talks of recent years. Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin couldn't reach an agreement.
So, there's no deal.
In this video, I'll walk you through the key outcomes of the Putin-Trump meeting, what led up to it, what shaped the talks between the two presidents, and what might come next. How the situation on the front lines affects negotiations, and how Trump could pressure Putin if the talks collapse. Right now, together with experts, I'll try to answer the main questions about the Alaska meeting. But first, don't forget to subscribe if you haven't yet. And hit like, it really helps with YouTube's algorithm. On the morning of August 15th, Vladimir Putin flew to Alaska. On the way, he stopped in Magadan. Soon after, his plane headed for Anchorage. 500,000 people tracked the 224 as it approached. But in the end, it turned out it wasn't his plane. The plane carrying Putin flew with its transponder switched off. Still, the sheer number of people glued to the plane flight radar app shows just how high expectations were. Putin's and Trump's planes landed in Anchorage almost at the same time, around 8 p.m. local time. The historic greeting looked truly grand. As the presidents walked the tarmac, American fighter jets and a B-2 Spirit bomber flew overhead. The same bomber type struck Iranian nuclear sites just 6 weeks ago. But here, it didn't feel like intimidation, though the roar above Putin and Trump was hard to ignore. After a photo op on the Alaska 2025 stage, Putin and Trump got into Trump's Cadillac, and that's where the talks essentially began. Putin's RS limousines had been flown in, but in the end, they drove off together. The pageantry only raised expectations, but the meeting itself seems to have fallen short. On the way to Alaska, Putin's spokesman Dmitry Peskov said the talks would last 6 to 7 hours, one-on-one.
Obviously, Ukraine is on the agenda. It's a very complex, very multifaceted issue. But both presidents are showing goodwill to solve problems through dialogue.
Later, they were joined by foreign ministers Sergei Lavrov and Marco Rubio, along with aides Yuri Ushakov and Steve Witkoff. In the end, the talks lasted just 2.5 hours. A press conference had been planned, but instead the presidents gave short statements. No questions from journalists allowed.
The talks were constructive and respectful, thorough and useful. I'd like to thank my American colleague again for the invitation to Alaska. Meeting here makes sense. Our countries may be divided by oceans, but we are close neighbors. When we stepped off the planes, I said, "Good afternoon, dear neighbor. It's good to see you alive and well."
Then the Russian president reminded everyone how during World War II, the US sent supplies to the USSR through Alaska under Lend-Lease. And so no speech without a history lesson. When Putin got to the point, he repeated that the root causes of the conflict must be addressed, and echoed Trump's line about who bears responsibility for the war. Interestingly, many American journalists noted this. Putin spoke first. This broke protocol. Normally, the host president speaks first, then gives the floor to the guest. But here, Putin went first, and he spoke longer. Over 8 minutes for Putin, just over 3 for Trump.
For a lasting peace in Ukraine, all root causes of the crisis must be eliminated. Back in 2022, during my last contacts with the previous administration, I tried to convince my American colleague not to push events to the point of escalation in the form of military action. I warned directly that would be a big mistake. Today we hear President Trump say, "If I had been president, there would be no war." I believe that's true. I confirm it.
In the second half of his speech, after the history lesson, Putin flipped through a few pages of text, likely skipping part of what was prepared. But before that, he said something new. Words he hadn't used before.
I agree with President Trump. He's right. Ukraine's security must be ensured. Of course, we're ready to work on this.
Security guarantees for Ukraine have been Volodymyr Zelensky's core demand in any talks. Those guarantees were discussed at a video conference between European leaders and Trump ahead of the Alaska meeting. I'll come back to that later. But the key words came from Trump. Speaking after Putin, he said,
I believe we had a very productive meeting. There were many points that we agreed on, most of them, I would say, a couple of big ones that we haven't quite gotten there, but we've made some headway. So there's no deal until there's a deal. I will call up NATO in a little while. I will call up the various people that I think are appropriate, and I'll, of course, call up President Zelensky and tell him about today's meeting.
If Putin ended on trade after his Lend-Lease history, Trump thanked his own team and the Russian businessmen involved in the talks, likely meaning Kirill Dmitriev, a member of Putin's delegation. And that was basically it. Trump had little else to say. Both presidents were expected to take questions, but that never happened. Had the talks collapsed, only Donald Trump would have appeared before the press. So on one hand, the talks didn't collapse, but on the other, nothing major seems to have happened. Another detail after the Putin-Trump meeting, a dinner was planned for the rest of the delegations, a continuation of negotiations, but it was cancelled. Instead, Vladimir Putin went to lay flowers at the graves of Soviet pilots and then presented icons to a local Orthodox priest. Analysts, including Trump's former national security advisor John Bolton, said Putin walked away with far more than Bolton's old boss. The war clearly will go on, and why that benefits only Putin, I'll explain later. Putin's visit to the US, his first in 10 years, ended there. But before leaving, he invited Trump to Moscow, and he did it in English.
Thank you very much, Vladimir.
Next time in Moscow.
Oh, that's an interesting one. I don't know. I'll get a little heat on that one, but I could see it possibly happening.
Whether Trump will actually fly to Moscow is unknown. But Putin's invitation sounded like he has no plans to meet with Zelensky anytime soon. A summit of the Russian, Ukrainian, and US presidents could have been the key outcome of Alaska, but it wasn't. After both presidents left, Trump gave an interview to Fox News. In it, he advised Zelensky, make a deal. Though what kind of deal remains unclear. He also said he would not impose new sanctions on Russia, and he confirmed that territorial concessions were on the table in his talks with Putin. On those points, the sides had reached agreement. But again, what concessions and what deal remain a mystery. Then came the first leaks in US media. The Economist journalist Oliver Carroll, citing a source, claimed the sides reached a preliminary deal. The main point, he said, was a ceasefire in the air. Allegedly, it would take effect even before any trilateral summit. Carroll added, next week will be interesting. And indeed, talk of halting airstrikes had surfaced in the press days before Alaska. But will it actually happen? Time will tell, more precisely, next week. For now, the only official news is about phone calls. On the morning of August 16th, Trump spoke at length with Zelensky and also held calls with NATO colleagues. The White House confirmed. Zelensky announced he plans to visit the US on Monday, August 18th. He said he had a meaningful conversation. First one-on-one, then with European leaders. They spoke for more than an hour and a half. Zelensky stressed that Ukraine supports a trilateral summit with the US and Russia. America's strength influences the course of events, he said. And he added, it is important for Europeans to be involved at every stage, to ensure reliable security together with America. Ever since the meeting was announced, all sides had been preparing intensively. Ukraine convened a video conference with allies, along with Trump and Zelensky. It included US Vice President J.D. Vance, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, and European Council President Antonio Costa, and also the leaders of France, Germany, Finland, Italy, and Poland. The New York Times described the conference as the result of extensive diplomatic work by Zelensky. Before it, Kyiv feared Trump might propose a ceasefire deal unacceptable to Ukraine, namely giving up part of its territory. For Putin, such a meeting could also mean breaking through isolation and easing sanctions. But after the video conference, Zelensky and several others spoke positively about the outcome. At it, Trump promised to offer Ukraine security guarantees, but without committing weapons or soldiers. And these guarantees, he stressed, would be given outside of NATO. Following the conference, Zelensky laid out 5 principles that Trump pledged to follow in talks with Putin. Among them, a ceasefire, Russia's consent to Ukraine joining NATO, and a trilateral summit with Trump and Putin. Alongside Putin, the Russian delegation included Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, Defense Minister Andrei Belousov, and Kirill Dmitriev, head of the Direct Investment Fund. Their presence made sense. One of the planes that flew to Alaska, though, was the infamous Il-96, the same plane type. To a drug smuggling case in Argentina. But that's the plane. What about the people? Dmitriev has negotiated with the US before. Lavrov, of course, is expected. And he made an entrance in Anchorage, wearing a jacket with USSR written across it. He looked more like a hockey coach than a diplomat at war and peace talks. Belousov, the defense minister, showed up in a suit. His role in war negotiations is obvious. But Finance Minister Anton Silvanov's presence was unusual. It sparked speculation that sanctions and the economy were on the agenda. Certainly not another history lecture, like those Vladimir Medinsky, Russia's lead negotiator, during the 2022 and 2025 Turkey talks, delivered to the Ukrainians. Overall, the Russian delegation looked solid. And it raised expectations of solid results. On the US side, pro-government Russian media first reported the lineup: Trump Senator J.D. Vance, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, and Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. But Reuters later corrected it. Vance wasn't there. Instead, Secretary of Commerce Howard Lutnick flew in, along with CIA Director John Ratcliffe, and also White House Chief of Staff Susie Wiles, her deputy Dan Scavino, and Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt. On the eve of the meeting, global media reported the economic agenda would likely include joint development of rare earth minerals. Remember when rare earth minerals suddenly became the hot topic? Then everyone forgot about them, and now they're back. This time in Alaska. According to the Telegraph, Trump was expected to pitch Putin on joint mining in territories seized from Ukraine. Specifically lithium. Lithium powers batteries. And Ukraine holds 10% of the world's reserves, including in areas occupied by Russia over the past 3.5 years. The US has already struck a rare earth deal with Ukraine. You probably remember Zelensky coming to Washington to sign it and leaving in scandal after a public clash with Trump.
You will not have war.
Don't tell us what we're going to feel. We're trying to solve a problem. Don't tell us what we're going to feel.
I'm not telling you.
Because you're in no position to dictate that. Remember this.
Despite the drama, the deal was signed. Under it, the US guarantees development and protection of the deposits plus investment. Ukraine keeps ownership of the resources, but half the revenue goes into a joint fund. Now the Telegraph suggests Russia might somehow be brought into that deal. How? No one knows. And it's unclear whether Putin even accepted Trump's offer.
As for Trump's economic ideas, rare earth minerals projects, flashy joint ventures, most have little to do with reality. And if they ever do materialize, it'll be far, far in the future. That's why I don't see much point in taking them seriously. They may sign something, but it's mostly abstract, detached from real life. And when it comes to sanctions, it's naive to expect the US to unilaterally lift them. It's naive to expect the US to unilaterally lift them. I just don't believe it.
Another possible economic topic was concessions to Russia in aviation industry. Since 2022, Russian airspace has been closed to US and European airlines. They don't fly there anymore. But the toughest sanctions? Boeing and Airbus stopped servicing Russian planes. For over 3 years now, maintenance, repairs, certification have all been a nightmare. Parts are being brought in through third countries. And of course, there aren't new planes, and none of this makes flying in Russia any safer. Nearly 70% of Russia's fleet is Boeing or Airbus. They make up almost 90% of all flight hours. Of all foreign jets, half are Boeing. Maybe soon airlines will at least be allowed to service their own planes officially. Trump may have offered Putin a deal to lift Boeing restrictions. Before flying to Alaska, Putin flagged another possible agenda item. He gathered top officials to discuss the talks.
I asked you to gather today to update you on the progress of negotiations on the Ukrainian crisis.
The Kremlin released a 90-second clip where Putin slipped in another likely summit topic.
If we reach agreement on the next stages in the area of control over strategic offensive weapons and armaments.
That points to the New START Treaty, the agreement between Russia and the US that sets limits on nuclear warheads and delivery systems. The first such deal was signed in 1991. by Gorbachev and George H.W. Bush just 3 weeks before the August coup. Since then, the treaty's been renewed several times. The latest version, New Start, was signed by Medvedev and Obama. It capped warheads at 1,050 and delivery vehicles, missiles, subs, bombers at 700. Crucially, it also allowed mutual inspections. American experts in Russia, Russian inspectors in the US. But in 2023, Moscow suspended its participation, part of a broader nuclear escalation.
I am forced to announce today that Russia is suspending its participation in the Strategic Arms Treaty.
During the war, the Russian military has held nuclear drills, tested the Poseidon nuclear submarine, and according to satellite images, is preparing a new test on Novaya Zemlya, possibly the Burevestnik missile. Meanwhile, just a day before the Alaska meeting, the Washington Post reported that Putin had arrived with no real plan. Normally, talks at this level are prepared down to the last detail. This time, there wasn't enough time, but that's hard to believe. Trump often hinted at the possibility of a personal meeting. He's known for relying on instincts, so that's his negotiation style. Many experts and media expected the talks to fail, not least because Trump had fired all his Russia advisors. Just before the Alaska summit, the Financial Times wrote that things got even more complicated after Elon Musk's budget cuts. Because of them, several agencies focused on Russia and Ukraine shut down. Their investigations had been used by both the administration and US intelligence. And with that backdrop, Trump flew in to negotiate with Putin. His main envoy on Russia, Steve Witkoff, a real estate developer. Right after Trump's conference with European leaders and Zelensky, US media reported preparations for a three-way meeting. Later, in a Fox News interview, Trump said the next move was up to Zelensky. He had to agree to the deal that Trump and Putin had allegedly worked out. That directly contradicted Trump's official post-summit statement. In the same interview, he also said he was ready for a trilateral meeting. But who would organize it or when remains unclear.
As for a possible compromise between Russia and Ukraine, there is no real readiness on that front. The only option that's been actively discussed since last year is a ceasefire along the front line. Trump has been pushing for it. And Aviv officially has agreed in principle, but Putin isn't ready to commit.
Still, Putin holds one important card. In spring and summer, the Russian army advanced on several fronts. Right before the negotiations, they achieved a significant breakthrough, piercing Ukraine's defenses in the Donetsk region. Many military analysts rushed to call it a potential disaster for the Ukrainian army. While Russia and US were preparing the summit, Russian forces were scoring victories on the ground. Early last week, Ukrainian and Russian sources, backed by international analysts, reported a breakthrough near Dobropilya, a town in Donetsk with a pre-war population of 30,000. Now it's heavily destroyed, and most of the civilians are gone. But militarily, it's become one of the most important points on the map.
The Ukrainian army is facing very serious challenges, perhaps the most serious in a year. Russia's current strategy is clear: flank defensive positions through the fields, cut off supply roads, and force Ukrainian troops to retreat without getting bogged down in major urban battles. That's exactly what we're seeing now. The front between the cities was breached back in June. After that, Russian forces began pushing north of the Pokrovsk agglomeration, along Novoekonomichna.
That town lies just north of another key point, Pokrovsk. Russian troops have been storming it for a year, capturing the city. It would open the way to the regional borders. On August 10th, reports came in of a 10-kilometer breakthrough near Pokrovsk. Sources used words like collapse, fall, and breach of the front line, meaning Ukraine's defenses were broken before its troops could retreat to a deeper line. Still, military analysts and bloggers on both sides say there's no visual proof yet, no footage of fighting or captured villages in that sector.
Pokrovsk is the anchor of defense in southwest Donetsk region, a large city surrounded by smaller settlements that together make defense sustainable. There's even a saying, Ukraine smears out the Russian offensive counteroffensive with cities. That's the core strategy of Zelensky, his team, and the military command. Turn cities and industrial hubs into fortress zones where battles can drag on for months, just like Chasiv Yar, which the Russian army has been storming in one form or another for a year.
The Ukrainian command denies any disaster. Viktor Tregobov, spokesman for Ukraine's Dnipro tactical group, said the armed forces managed to cut off Russian units and there is no collapse. The Ukrainian General of Staff officially states that the situation near Dobropilya has stabilized. But even if the breakthrough really failed, it still highlights problems for Ukraine's army. A Ukrainian officer told the BBC if troops had to be redeployed to stop the incursion, that means fewer forces elsewhere. And here too, the situation will likely need to be stabilized. Some analysts argue that Ukraine may not have had to send in extra reserves at all. Still, Ukraine is short of troops along the front line, while Russia has narrowed its technological gap just before the breakthrough. The Wall Street Journal published an overview of the front, mostly from Ukraine's side. The picture is that Russia once looked clumsy and outdated compared to Ukraine. Now both armies have reverted to Soviet-style warfare. For Ukraine, that means the doctrine of not one step back. But this leads to heavy losses among the most battle-ready units at a time of dwindling manpower.
The key breakthrough is between Pokrovsk and Kostiantynivka. Once the autumn rains begin, offensives will become far more costly. Until then, Russia could try to drive Ukraine out of the entire southwest of Donetsk. Take Pokrovsk, take Kostiantynivka, leaving Ukraine with only the northwest of the oblast.
In recent months, Russia has advanced steadily toward the administrative borders of Donetsk and Luhansk regions. On paper, the numbers may not look dramatic, but compared to last year, the pace is far quicker. Ukraine's Deep State Map project reports, in July 2024, Russia gained 170 square kilometers. In July this year, 515, that's triple the rate. 2 weeks ago, Russia's defense ministry announced the capture of Chasiv Yar. For scale, it's only 15 kilometers from Bakhmut, which fell back in 2023.
As for explaining to Russians why this war continues, state media repeat the same. The people of Donbas made their choice, and so on. Russia will keep fighting for full control of the Luhansk and Donetsk regions. In Donetsk region, about 30% of the territory remains outside Russian control. That's a large area, and battles will continue there. Would Putin trade away Zaporizhzhia or Kherson in exchange for Donbas? Unlikely.
Pushing to the administrative borders of Donetsk and Luhansk regions is one of Moscow's clearest objectives. Both regions are written into Russia's revised constitution. And from the very start, liberating Donbas was among the stated goals of the war. Yet none of these four regions, Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, Zaporizhzhia, is fully under Russian control. At present, Russia holds over 70% of Donbas and 95% of Luhansk. In recent weeks and months, its army has tried to sustain a high tempo of advance. The picture in Kherson and Zaporizhzhia is different. Russia seized Kherson early in the war, but lost it after Ukraine's counteroffensive in November 2022. That was a major political setback. By then Kherson, like Zaporizhzhia, Donetsk and Luhansk, had already been written into Russia's constitution. And just before that, Ukraine had retaken parts of Donetsk, Luhansk and Kharkiv regions. Today, Russia is again advancing there. After Putin's meeting with Steve Witkoff on August 6th, reports surfaced that Moscow might accept not having full control over Kherson and Zaporizhzhia. Meanwhile, Russian troops also hold small strips of land in Kharkiv, Sumy and Mykolaiv regions. But none of these has been formally added to the constitution. In the run-up to the Alaska summit, Western media speculated about a possible land swap.
Russian footholds in Kharkiv and Sumy regions could serve as bargaining chips. But there's another question. Would Zelensky agree to any trade? For now, the most Kyiv might accept is withdrawing from small pieces of Kursk region held by its own forces, while Russia would be expected to pull back from much larger parts of Sumy and Kharkiv. But that isn't the main issue.
The breakthrough near Dobropilya, close to Pokrovsk, did boost Putin's confidence, made him believe he could still win. Ukraine doesn't share that view. Kyiv will keep resisting.
The Alaska summit caught everyone off guard. It followed an ultimatum from Trump to Putin: ceasefire or sanctions. The deadline was August 8th. 2 days before, U.S. envoy Witkoff met with Putin in the Kremlin. Just before the deadline, Trump imposed punitive tariffs on India, a crucial buyer of Russian oil. Roughly 40% of Russian exports go there. Trump also threatened to expand secondary sanctions and could still raise tariffs on China.
India refused to stop importing Russian oil. The very next day, Modi called Putin to discuss strategic partnership. And for the first time in decades, an Indian leader is now preparing a visit to China. Direct flights between New Delhi and Beijing resumed right after the tariffs were announced. So far, instead of isolating Russia, the tariffs have nudged India closer to Moscow and Beijing. That shift only strengthened Putin at the talks.
After this, both sides have agreed to meet in Alaska. Still, Trump warned, if Alaska brings no results, Russia will face severe consequences. Bloomberg reports the Russian economy is under heavy strain from sanctions. One official admitted anonymously, Moscow cannot afford to anger Trump by dismissing his peace initiative. That may be why the economy is Russia's top priority in Alaska.
Putin doesn't want sanctions. The question is different. How possible is it to cancel the sanctions? And what concessions is Moscow prepared to make in return? A full lifting is out of the question, especially with the EU there. The idea is meaningless. And in practice, Putin does not put economics above his political ambitions.
Meanwhile, inside Russia, restrictions and crackdowns only intensify. The internet is now heavily limited. Calls on Telegram and WhatsApp have been banned. No sign at all of a post-war thaw. Propaganda keeps fueling the war mood. On live television, hosts openly talk of marching on Berlin and Paris. Even Trump is no longer framed as Moscow's friend.
Berlin and Madrid are the perfect location for our armed forces. How good would we look in Paris?
Meanwhile, the electronic summons registry is fully operational. The State Duma is weighing year-round conscription. Soon, the draft may run not just in spring and fall, but all year long. These moves signal no interest in peace. If anything, the opposite. They point to a desire to prolong the war. Ukraine is also escalating its military budget. This year, defense spending will rise to 26% of GDP. Kyiv has found new ways with allies to purchase U.S. weapons through Europe. Washington resumed arms deliveries in July, sending artillery and rocket systems. Trump pledged to expand military support further. At the same time, Zelensky has not lowered the draft age. The so-called bussificationist. Roundups of conscripts continues. Yet both Zelensky and Commander-in-Chief Syrskyi have said openly, Ukraine's conscription strategy must change. Since February, a new law allows voluntary service from age 18 to 24. Until 25, enlistment is only by choice. No forced conscription for now. So while Russia is tightening its draft system, Ukraine has not, at least not yet, even if it just affects regular conscription and not the soldiers at war. At least outside Russia's territories.
There is also public sentiment to consider. Polls show that over 60% of Ukrainians reject ending the war on Russia's terms, on Putin's ultimatum.
So it's far too early to speak of peace on the horizon. Neither Russia nor Ukraine is taking real steps to ease tensions. Both keep pouring resources into defense. Russia is ramping up drone production. Ukraine is doing the same. And no one expected budgets or draft policy to shift because of a single summit. If Trump loses patience, he could walk away from the talks entirely. Trump has said more than once that he is dissatisfied with both Putin and Zelensky. American media claim he is losing patience. He promised to end the war in 100 days. At first, he even said 24 hours, but neither happened.
It seems less like a real intention and more like a scare tactic. For Trump, ending the war in Ukraine has become a matter of principle. It is tied to his reputation and to his vanity. That is clear now. The closer we we get to October, when the Nobel Peace Prize is decided, the clearer it becomes. Trump desperately wants that prize.
The negotiations with Putin and Trump likely have not brought Ukraine closer to peace. Trump may not end the war in time. Winners will be announced in October. In Alaska, both presidents spoke of future meetings. Trump has been invited to Moscow, and he will need patience. He had said before, if Alaska succeeded, the next round would come quickly. But no new meetings have been announced. Not with Zelensky, not without him. And yet, whether Alaska is judged a success or failure, the meeting itself was already an achievement. Before, it seemed the war's outcome would be decided only at the front. Now diplomacy, especially Trump's diplomacy, might determine the end, or his personal drive to settle conflicts and win the Nobel Prize. He managed to calm Armenia and Azerbaijan. Maybe he thinks he can do the same with Russia and Ukraine. So the question is, what was this meeting really about? Who came out ahead? Expectations were sky high, as if it were a new Yalta or a new Munich. That something would be divided, something decided. Usually at this level, leaders meet only when aides have already agreed in advance. There was a sense that Washington and Moscow might already have struck a deal. To divide Ukraine, to divide Europe, that the summit would be a formality. A press conference would follow. Here is the new order, and the world must accept it. But it didn't happen? Maybe because America has little leverage left over Russia. And Russia, in turn, has nothing real to offer the US. The relations have cooled for years. All sanctions possible, without cutting off the branch you sit on, are already in place. Everything is frozen. And so, it is very difficult to twist each other's arms. So twisting each other's arms in these talks is nearly impossible. All that remains is nuclear saber rattling. Trump even mentioned it. Nuclear weapons are bad, but nothing new there. And don't forget, Ukraine wasn't at the table, which makes any talk of territorial concession strange, because Ukraine can simply say, no, we will not give up Kherson, we will not give up Zaporizhzhia. We don't care what you agreed without us. In that case, Trump always has an excuse. He can say, look, I did all I could. Ukraine is unwilling to negotiate. My friend Vladimir Putin offered a good deal. Zelensky refused. I'm done with it. Now let Europe handle it. And according to early expert commentary, this is one of the most likely scenarios. Trump sees no way to reach a deal with Putin. So to save face, he will declare the talks a success. 10 out of 10. He actually said that. Trump did everything possible. The blame falls on Zelensky, on Biden, on Obama, on anyone but Trump. Trump is the great peacemaker, only thwarted by those who refuse to negotiate. So he asks, give me the Nobel Peace Prize already. I'll move on to other conflicts to resolve. We'll see. In the coming days or weeks, things may become clearer. And friends, I want to hear your thoughts in the comments.
What Alaska did make realistic for the first time is a meeting with Zelensky, not alone, but with Trump present. And so, the main tangible result of Trump's summit with Putin isn't a ceasefire, it isn't a peace deal. It is the prospect of a meeting of all three leaders. Concrete terms for ending the war are unrealistic right now.
I wouldn't expect decisive or fast results from Alaska. Even if a broad framework were agreed, it would only be the first step. Much more would be needed. Talks with Zelensky, working groups, detailed negotiations. The path to a peace agreement would still be long.
Zelensky and Putin have not been this close to face-to-face talks since the war began. Whether they succeed and how long it takes, no one knows. But one thing is clear, the Alaska summit was a major event. So tell me in the comments, friends, will Trump actually end the war in Ukraine? Will the peace he promises be lasting or only temporary?